The Gulf was wrong before the light came up. Elias Cord knew this the way a man knows the smell of his own house. Not by thinking, but by the body's old knowledge, accumulated over 58 years of standing at the edge of salt water and paying attention. He had risen at 4 a.m, as he always did, and walked the 3 blocks from his house to the dock on the bay side. And when he stepped out onto the planking and looked south across the water, the wrongness was there before he could name it. The air was still. That was part of it. In early September on the Gulf Coast, there was always movement, the thermal breath of the water, the low push of the trade winds, the small stirrings that came and went through the night and settled into the day's first heat. But this morning, there was nothing. The water lay flat and dull as pewter, and the only sound was the ticking of his boat's rigging against the mast, a sound that usually meant a light breeze, though there was no breeze at all. He stood for a moment and listened to it, and could not explain what was moving the lines. He had fished the Gulf of Mexico for 40 years. He had watched his father fish it before him, and had listened to his father talk about it, about its moods, its temperatures, its colors at different seasons and different depths. His father had said once that the Gulf was not like the Atlantic or the Pacific, that it was an enclosed body, a contained thing, and that it responded to disturbances differently than open ocean. It held things in. It remembered Elias stepped down into his boat and felt the hull under his feet. The craft was a 22-foot wooden sloop, 12 years old, built by Samuel Akers on the north end of the island. He had repainted her hull twice since buying her, always the same dull red below the waterline. He knew every plank of her. He sat on the stern thwart and looked at the water and waited for the sky to get light enough to tell him something. The eastern horizon turned the color of old iron, then gray, then a weak, washed-out amber that gave nothing back. He would go out. He would always go out. That much he knew. He had noticed the birds 3 days ago. The pelicans were the first thing. There was a colony of them on the east end of the island, near the jetties, had been there as long as anyone could remember, hundreds of them, sitting on the rocks in the mornings and launching themselves in long gliding lines over the surf. He had seen them his whole life. They were as fixed a part of the island as the buildings on the strand or the lighthouse at the end of the seawall. On the 1st of September, they were gone. He had gone to the jetties in the evening to check his crab lines, and had noticed it without fully registering it. The emptiness of the rocks, the absence of that familiar massed whiteness against the gray stone. He thought they had moved down the beach. It happened sometimes, for reasons he didn't understand. He did not think much of it. But then the next day, walking the beach road, he counted the shorebirds and found them thin. The long-billed curlews that normally fed in the shallows behind the island in the bay were absent. The willets had pulled back from the surf line and gathered in the high grass of the dunes in a way he had not seen before. They were not feeding. They were sitting very still, their heads turned into what little wind there was, and they did not flush when he walked past them, which was unusual. Normally, they rose ahead of him in a scattered panic of wings. These birds sat and watched him pass. He stopped and looked at them. They looked back. A dozen willets, gray-brown in the morning light, lined up in the coarse grass above the tide line, their eyes fixed on nothing. He had heard old fishermen talk about birds before storms. Every old hand on the coast had something to say about it. The way they moved inland, the way they stopped feeding, the way they seemed to pull away from the water, as if the water had become something they no longer trusted. He had heard it and believed it in the abstract way that a man believes things he has been told but never tested. Now he was testing it, and the belief became something harder and more specific. That evening, he counted the birds on the bay side of the island. There were more than there should be. Shore birds that belonged on the Gulf side were now crowded into the calmer water. Hundreds of them, sitting low, barely moving. He went home and wrote nothing down because he had never kept a journal. But he did not forget. The docks in the morning had their own kind of talk. He brought his boat in at 10 o'clock with a half box of red snapper and 2 amberjack, which was not much for 6 hours of work, but better than some of the others had done. Carlos Mendes had come in empty-handed and was angry about it in the quiet way he was angry about things, not speaking, just moving around the dock with a tightness in his jaw that everyone knew and let alone. "Fish are down," said Pete Hollowell. He was sitting on a bollard with his boots off, examining a blister on his heel. Pete was 53 and had been fishing out of Galveston since he was 14. 3rd day running. "Can't find them in the usual places." "Where'd you look?" Elias asked. "Where I always look, 12 miles out around the reef." "Nothing there." Tried the shelf. "Nothing. They've moved." "Fish move," Pete said, as if this explained everything and required no further consideration. Elias tied off his boat and began unloading his catch into the icebox. The fish market was 3 blocks away, and he would wheel them over on a hand cart. He did this every morning and had done it for years. The money was not good, but it was steady, and he had learned to live inside its smallness. "Barometer's been dropping," said the harbor master, Walter Grubb, who was standing in the doorway of his office, smoking a pipe. He said it without particular urgency, as if noting a mild inconvenience. "How much?" Elias asked. "Some. Not a lot. Steady drop for 2 days." "Steady drop is worse than a quick one," Elias said. Grubb looked at him without expression. "Maybe so," he said, and took a pull on his pipe. Elias wanted to say more. He could feel the shape of what he wanted to say, the birds, the water, the strange stillness that morning, the quality of the air that was not right, a kind of heaviness that he could not measure or point to, but that pressed against him. But he knew how it would sound. He had said things like this before, over the years, and they had come to nothing. Or they had come to a modest squall that blew itself out by afternoon. And after that, people remembered what you had said, and they did not forget it. So he said nothing more. He loaded his fish onto the cart and wheeled it down the road. The color of the water had changed. He had first noticed it 2 days ago, though he had been watching for it without knowing he was watching. The Gulf of Mexico in summer was a deep blue-green, the color of shallow tropical water, clear and light, the bottom visible in places even 20 feet down. In winter it ran grayer, cloudier with sediment, stirred by the northern winds. The change of color marked the seasons as reliably as anything on land. But this was not that. This was something he had seen only once before, 15 years ago, before a bad storm that had not been as bad as the one he feared now. The water had taken on a gray-brown color, murky and opaque, like water that had been stirred from deep below. Not surface turbulence. The surface was nearly calm. It was as if something had changed in the water's interior, as if the usual layering had been disrupted by some distant pressure. He went out in the afternoon, not to fish, but to look. He rowed the small, flat-bottomed skiff he used for bay work, and went out the channel and into the open gulf, and sat with the oars up and looked. He put his hand in it. The temperature was wrong. The surface water should have been warm. It was early September, the tail end of the long summer. But it was cooler than it should be. Not cold, just cool. As if something had pushed the warm layer aside and let the deeper water come up. He cupped some water in his palm and held it. There were small particles suspended in it, not the normal microscopic life of the Gulf, but something churned up, something from the bottom. He had no word for what he was seeing, except the one his father had used. Disturbed, the swell came from the south, in long, slow, regular intervals. It was the kind of swell that had nothing to do with local wind. The surface was nearly calm, and yet the water moved with this deep, rhythmic breathing, up and down, 8 seconds apart. Long period swell, the kind that traveled thousands of miles from its source. He sat in his skiff and felt the swell lift him and lower him, lift him and lower him, and thought about where it had come from. Galveston in 1900 believed in itself completely. It was the largest city in Texas. It had 40,000 people and was growing. It had the finest buildings on the Gulf Coast, the great Tremont Hotel, where men in good suits drank bourbon in the afternoon, the Bishop's Palace with its towers of stone, the mansions along Broadway with their galleries and their carriages. It had electric streetcars and telephone lines, and the U.S. Weather Bureau in a brick building on Mechanic Street. It had a deep water port that handled more cotton than any city in the nation, except New Orleans. Elias walked through the Strand district in the afternoon of September 4th and felt the city's confidence as a physical thing, a kind of density in the air, a solidity that the stone buildings gave off, the weight of commerce and certainty. Men moved between offices with the purposeful step of people who knew where they were going and why. Women in summer dresses walked the wooden sidewalks. Delivery wagon loaded with crates of bottled goods clattered past, and the horse's hooves on the street pavement had a sound of permanence. He was not part of this world. He moved through it as a visitor, as he always had. He wore the same boots he wore on his boat, salt-stained at the toes, and his hands were permanently darkened by sun and salt and the oil of fish, and the cuffs of his coat, his good coat, the one he wore in town, were frayed at the edge in a way that announced itself to anyone who looked. He was a fisherman. The city was not made for fishermen, but he had lived here 40 years, and he knew its shape as well as any of them. He knew the grade of the land, the way the island rose imperceptibly from the bay side to the Gulf side, or rather how it did not rise, how it stayed flat and low and exposed, barely lifting itself above the water on either side. He knew the highest point of the island was 8 feet above sea level. He had measured it himself once with a borrowed surveyor's level, just to know 8 feet. In a city of 40,000 souls, he walked past a shop window that showed a display of new fall merchandise, fabric, buttons, ribbon. A woman was arranging it from the inside, her back to him. The glass was very clean. He could see his own reflection passing across it. An old man with a weathered face, moving through the bright afternoon, not stopping. The Weather Bureau office was on the 3rd floor of the Levee building on Mechanic Street, and Isaac Klein occupied it with the calm authority of a man who trusted his instruments. Klein was 36 years old and had written, 4 years earlier, an article for a national meteorological journal in which he argued that a major hurricane could not strike Galveston. The argument was based on the shape of the Texas coast, the shallow waters of the continental shelf, the way approaching storms were deflected by the prevailing winds. He had made the argument clearly and with evidence, and he had not reconsidered it since. Elias had met him twice before. Klein was not unkind, but he had the manner of a man explaining obvious things to someone who did not understand them. And Elias had learned to take what information he could from these meetings and leave without argument. He climbed the stairs to the office on the afternoon of September 5th and found Klein at his desk with a sheaf of weather charts spread before him. A younger man, Douglas, was at the barometer in the corner, reading the instrument and writing down numbers. "Record," Klein said, without looking up. He knew Elias' name because Elias had come before. "The glass has been dropping 2 days," Elias said. "Yes." Klein picked up one of the charts. Gradual decline. Consistent with the system we're tracking in the Caribbean. Tropical disturbance moving northwest. Our latest information has it turning north and northeast near Cuba. Away from us. Away from us. Yes. He set down the chart. The barometric reading this morning is 29.4. Not alarming. The swells running south to north. Long period. 8-9 seconds. Klein looked at him then. "How are you measuring period, counting?" "The way my father taught me," a brief pause. "That's a rough measure. It's the measure I have." Klein studied him for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether to be patient or dismissive, and settled somewhere between the two. "There is weather to the south, Mr. Cord." "I don't dispute that. But our information indicates it is not headed for us. We are watching it carefully. If anything changes, the Bureau will issue appropriate advisories." Elias thanked him and went back down the stairs. In the street, he stood for a moment in the afternoon sun, which was very bright and cast no shadows that made sense. He had said what he came to say. He had been heard and not believed. This was a familiar position. He walked home. His house was on Avenue M, close enough to the Gulf side that on clear nights he could hear the surf. It was a small house, white-painted wood, 1 story, with a porch facing the street and a lean-to kitchen at the back. He had built the porch himself 15 years ago, adding it to the original structure, because he needed a place to sit outside that was not in the direct sun. He had used good lumber, and it had held. The porch boards were gray now from weather, and one of the posts had a slight lean to it that he had never gotten around to correcting. And there was a particular squeaking board third from the door that he had stepped over so many times it was entirely automatic, his foot swinging left without thought. He had lived in this house with his wife for 22 years. Margaret had died of fever in the spring of 1895, and he had lived here alone since then, which was 5 years, and the house in those 5 years had acquired the quality of a place where only one person lived, not neglect exactly, but a simplification, a shedding of certain things. The curtains she had chosen were still on the windows, but had faded. The kitchen table still had 4 chairs, though he only ever used one. In the bedroom, there was a photograph of her on the bureau, taken in 1888, and he looked at it every morning and every evening without ceremony. The way a man checks a familiar thing to confirm it is still there. He was not a sentimental man. He had learned to live inside grief the way he lived inside, whether not fighting it, not ignoring it, just keeping on. But in these days of September, with the strange quiet over the water and the birds gone from the rocks, he found himself thinking about her with a particular sharpness. Not longing. He had passed through longing years ago, but something more like clarity. She had known things he didn't know. She had trusted things he couldn't measure. He sat on the porch in the last light of the afternoon and smoked his pipe and listened to the surf, which was louder than it had been. He measured it against the sound he knew, the sound that was normal for this time of year, this kind of weather, this state of the tide. It was louder, not dramatically, not the roar of a coming storm, but louder than it had been yesterday. And yesterday, it had been louder than the day before he sat and listened until the light went, and then he went in and made supper. He had heard about Indianola from the men who survived it. It was 1886, 14 years ago, and Elias had been in his 40s then, already an established fisherman on the island, already a man who had lived his whole life within sight of the Gulf. He had not been in Indianola when the second great storm hit it. The first had been in 1875, and this one came 11 years later and finished what the first had started. He had heard the accounts from 3 men who had been there and who had made their way to Galveston afterward, men with the flat eyes of people who had seen something they would never fully leave behind. The oldest of them, a man named Burl, had fished out of Matagorda Bay his whole life. He came to Galveston with nothing, no boat, no gear, the clothes he was wearing, and spent a week sleeping in the shed behind the fish market before anyone understood his situation and got him a room. Elias had sat with him on 3 evenings while he was in Galveston, listening. Burl talked about the sky first. The sky the day before had been strange, he said, in a way that he could not describe to someone who had not seen it. Clear overhead, but with a quality of pressure, as if the clear sky was pressing down. And then a smell in the air that he associated with deep water, not the usual salt smell of the coast, but something older, something from below. He said the horses in the stable on the edge of town would not eat their feed and pulled at their ropes all afternoon. Then the water had begun to rise. Not from rain. There was no rain at first. The water simply began to come up from the bay side, slowly, steadily, as if the bay was filling from below. In the hours before the storm struck, the water in the main street of Indianola was already knee-deep, and it was still rising, and the sky was still not dramatic, still had that pressed, heavy look that Burl kept coming back to in his telling. Then the wind, and then the water came over everything, and then there was nothing. Galveston was not Indianola. Galveston was larger, better built, more established. Galveston had the Weather Bureau and the telegraph and 40,000 people who knew the coast. But it was also flat. It was also an island. It also sat between the bay and the Gulf, with 8 feet of elevation between it and the sea. Elias thought about Burl sometimes. He thought about the smell of deep water. On the morning of September 5th, he went out farther than usual. He headed due south, away from the island, and ran the engine at half speed. The sloop had a small gasoline engine he had installed 2 years ago, and went 12 miles before he cut the engine and let the boat sit. He did not put the lines in. He had not come to fish. The swell was running long and slow from the south-southeast. He sat in the stern and watched it come. Each wave lifted the bow of the sloop perhaps 3 feet, held it for a moment, and let it down, and then the next wave came. They were evenly spaced, these swells. He counted the interval. 7 seconds, then 8, then 7 again. A long period swell, generated by something far away, something large enough to set the whole body of the Gulf moving. He looked at the horizon to the south. There was nothing there, no cloud bank, no visible weather. Just the flat line where water met sky. But the sky above the horizon had a particular color at its base, a bruised, yellowish gray that was not the normal afternoon haze. He had seen this color before, on the far edge of approaching weather, when the weather itself was still below the curve of the earth. He sat and watched and measured what he could, and felt the rest with the part of him that did not measure. The fish were gone from here too. He had brought lines and put them in for 20 minutes and pulled them up empty. In 12 miles of running, he had seen only one school of fish, and they were moving fast, heading northeast, traveling in a tight formation close to the surface, the way fish did when something was driving them. He watched them go and did not try to intercept them. The water temperature was 68 degrees by his thermometer. In early September, it should have been closer to 80. Whatever the circulation in the deeper Gulf was doing, it was pushing cold water up. He wrote the number on the back of his hand in pencil, in case he wanted to show someone, though he doubted anyone would be interested. He sat out there alone for 2 hours, rising and falling with the swell, and then started the engine and headed back north toward the island. Thomas Barker lived 2 houses down and had been Elias' neighbor for 11 years. He was a carpenter, a good one, who built and repaired the wooden structures of the residential neighborhoods and the wharves, and he moved through his work with the precision of a man who understood load and joint and the behavior of wood under stress. He was 44 years old and had a wife and 3 grown children who had all moved to Houston and the Hill Country. He and his wife, Clara, lived in the house quietly, the way people live after their children are gone, filling the space in a different way. Elias found him in his backyard on the evening of September 5th, repairing a porch railing from a house 2 blocks away that someone had brought over in pieces. Thomas looked up when he heard Elias come through the gate and waved with the hand holding the mallet. "Barometer's been dropping," Elias said, taking the usual chair by the fence. Thomas considered this, fitting a tenon into its mortise. "How much?" "Enough. 3 days of drop, steady. There's always weather in September. This isn't ordinary September weather." Thomas looked at him. He had the carpenter's habit of sizing things up, angles, lengths, the fitness of a thing for its intended purpose. He applied this now to Elias and seemed to conclude something. "What makes you say that?" Elias told him about the birds, about the swell, about the color of the water, about the temperature. He laid it out as plainly as he could, without embellishment, just the facts as he had observed them. He watched Thomas's face while he talked. Thomas listened. He was a fair man, and he listened well. When Elias was done, he was quiet for a moment, fitting the railing tenon again and testing its tightness. "Could be a storm coming," he said. "Could be a bad one. I won't say you're wrong about the signs." He paused. "But this island's been here a long time, Elias. It's taken storms before. Not the right kind." "What's the right kind?" Elias looked at the fence boards, the grain of the weathered wood. "The kind that comes straight at you." Thomas turned back to his work. "Well, I suppose we'll know by the weekend." They sat in the evening for a while after that, Thomas finishing his work and Elias watching, and neither of them said anything more about it. The telegraph office on Post Office Street was where Elias went to find out what was happening in places he couldn't see. He knew the head clerk there, a young man named Davis who had been born on the island and whose father had been a fisherman before him. Davis was 26, precise in his work, and had a manner of speaking about weather information with the same careful lack of emphasis that characterized everything he said, as if the information itself was neutral and required no interpretation. Elias came in on the afternoon of September 6th and waited while Davis finished transmitting something. The sound of the key clicking in the small office with its smell of paper and machine oil, and the particular mustiness of old wood buildings near the water. "Anything from Cuba?" Elias asked when Davis looked up. Davis turned to a stack of incoming messages and sorted through them without hurry. "Report from Havana this morning. Storm system southeast of Cuba. Winds estimated at 80 miles per hour at the center, moving northwest at 10 miles per hour." He looked up. "Cuban Weather Service is calling it a major storm. Northwest," Elias said, "as of this morning." "Yes, the Weather Bureau here says it'll turn north." Davis was quiet for a moment. He had no opinion to offer on the matter, and he did not offer one. "That's their assessment," he said. "Bureau in Washington is saying northeast track. Cuba is closer. Cuba has better eyes on it, maybe," Davis said, in the careful neutral way, and then seemed to think he had said too much and turned back to his instruments. Elias stood there for a moment. Outside, the street had the normal afternoon sounds: a wagon, voices, the far sound of the streetcar on the line 2 blocks over. The sun was still bright. The people on the sidewalk, outside the window, moved with no sign of urgency. A woman was buying flowers from a cart on the corner. He thanked Davis and left. The Cuban Weather Service. He had never thought about the Cuban Weather Service before. He thought about it now, the men there, watching the same sky, the same water, making their own measurements, sending their numbers over the wire. They had better eyes on it. 10 hours ahead of it, he walked home in the afternoon heat, thinking about what better eyes could see. Morning of September 6th, he was up before 4. He had slept poorly, not from anxiety, or not only from that, but from the simple physical fact that the air in the house was wrong. The temperature had not dropped the way it normally dropped in the hours before dawn. It stayed warm and close, a thick warmth that was different from ordinary summer heat, that had a weight to it, a heaviness that pressed against the skin and did not let it breathe. He stood on the porch in the dark and listened to the surf. It was louder again. He could tell without measuring that the waves were striking the beach with more force than the night before, not dramatically different, not the sound of a building storm, but changed. More pressure behind them when the sky began to lighten. He looked south and east. The horizon was clear as it had been, but at altitude, at the height, where the high, thin clouds lived, there was a haze, barely visible, that dimmed the upper sky into something flat and whitish. It gave the light a quality he knew, diffuse, directionless, the kind of light that cast no clear shadow, the kind of light that came ahead of large weather. He looked at the sun when it cleared the horizon. There was a ring around it, faint but distinct, a circle of pale light at about 20 degrees from the disk, a halo, the product of ice crystals very high up, thin cirrus cloud, the leading edge of a large weather system. He had seen it before. He associated it with nothing good. He sat on the porch for an hour with his coffee and watched the sky. Nothing moved dramatically. Nothing announced itself. The day went on being a day, the heat building. A single pelican passing high and alone heading west, the road gathering its morning traffic. But the halo stayed, faint against the blue, and the light kept its diffuse quality, and the surf kept its new sound. At 8, he went inside and ate breakfast, and then walked to the beach. The beach on the Gulf side was wide and flat and white, and in summer it was used by bathers and promenaders and families from the more prosperous parts of the city. The bathhouses stood on pilings above the high tide line, large wooden structures, painted in colors that were cheerful in the right weather and bleak in gray light. Now they were nearly deserted in the early morning, their painted fronts facing the empty water, walked east along the surf line, keeping above the waterline, watching what the sea had left. The beach-cast material told a story if you knew how to read it. The normal debris of the Gulf, seaweed, small shells, the occasional dead jellyfish, was there, but among it were things that did not belong on the surface. Pieces of deep-water coral, flat and pale, several species of sea cucumber that lived below the photic zone, a single large squid, dead, its chromatophores faded to gray, longer than his arm, It had come from somewhere below 200 feet. He stopped and looked at the squid for a long time. It was a beautiful animal in its way. The long body perfectly tapered, the tentacles arranged as if it had simply lain down and rested. Its eye was still perfect, round and yellow, filmed slightly with death. Things from the deep were coming up. Whatever was happening in the water column, the temperature change, the disruption of the layers, the long period swell from the south. It was severe enough to bring deep water animals to the surface and then to the shore. He had no scientific framework for this. He had only what he'd seen and what he'd been told by men whose knowledge was older than any framework. He walked further and found more. A cluster of deep-water barnacles on a piece of driftwood, species he didn't recognize. Another squid, smaller. A mat of brown algae that was not a coastal variety. He stopped collecting and simply walked, looking down at what the water had decided to give up by the time he turned back. The beach had filled somewhat with the morning's early walkers, people moving along the tide line without looking at what was under their feet. He passed a man and woman arm in arm, talking, their faces turned toward each other. They were not looking at the water. He did not stop them to explain what the water was saying. Father Michael Donovan had been the priest at St. Patrick's Church since 1891, and he was one of the few people in Galveston who Elias felt would listen to him without immediately reaching for a counterargument. He was Irish from County Clare and had come to Galveston in the way of many Irish priests, assigned, without particular choice in the matter, to serve a community that included a great many Irish and Irish-descended families among the dock workers and the lower portions of the trades. He had the careful face of a man who had spent decades listening to confessions, not judgmental, not demonstrably compassionate, but attending. He was 60 years old and had been sick twice in the past 2 years, and this showed in a new thinness about him, a fragility at the edges. Elias found him in the garden behind the rectory on the afternoon of the 6th, cutting back the oleanders with a pair of long-handled shears. Stopped when he saw Elias come through the gate and stood with the shears at his side and waited. "There's a storm coming, Father," Elias said. "A bad one." The priest looked at him. "The Bureau hasn't said so. The Bureau is wrong." Father Donovan set the shears against the garden wall and walked to the bench under the live oak and sat down. He waited for Elias to sit beside him, and when Elias did, he folded his hands in his lap and looked at the oleanders, which were pink against the white garden wall. Elias told him what he'd seen and measured and felt over the past 5 days. He talked about the birds, about the swell, about the squid from the deep water, about the barometric drop and the halo and the quality of the light. He talked for 15 minutes, and the priest listened with the same attending face, not interrupting. When Elias was done, Father Donovan was quiet for a while. A mockingbird was singing somewhere in the oleanders. Then he said, "How bad? Bad enough that people should leave the island. The low-lying parts especially, the West End. That's a great many people to move." "Yes," another silence. "I can speak to people," the priest said carefully. "I can mention it. I have no authority to tell them to leave, Elias. None of us has that, I know. And if the storm turns north, if it misses us, I know, Elias said again. The priest nodded slowly. He looked at Elias with the attending face. Are you frightened? Elias considered this. Yes, he said. The wind on the evening of September 6th was wrong in a way he had been watching for. He had read the behavior of multidirectional wind as a sign of approaching circular storm systems. Knowledge that had come to him not from books, but from old men, from the accumulated testimony of people who had been watching the Gulf for generations. The principle was simple. As a rotating storm approached, the winds at different levels of the atmosphere moved in different directions. And this conflict showed itself in the clouds, in the feel of the air at ground level, in the small inconsistencies that a man who paid attention could detect. He stood on the beach at 6 in the evening and watched the clouds. At cloud level, the mid-level cumulus building in the south and southwest. The motion was from the north, consistent with the wind on the ground, which was coming from the nor-northeast at perhaps 10 miles an hour. But higher, in the thin cirrus that had been spreading all day from the south, the motion was clearly from the south, running opposite to the lower clouds, moving in the direction the lower wind was blowing from 2 winds, 2 directions, 2 altitudes. A rotating system organizing itself. He watched this for an hour, sitting on the seawall, and the more he watched, the more certain he became. The organization was there. The geometry of it was there. Something large was arranging itself, and the arrangement was visible if you were looking at the right things. The surf had increased again. He didn't have to measure it. He could feel it through the concrete of the seawall, a regular low vibration matching the intervals of the waves. The swell period had lengthened. He counted it. 9 seconds. 10. Coming from farther away. Or coming harder. He walked home in the late light, and the city was entirely ordinary around him. People eating on porches. A couple walking a dog. The sound of a piano from a house on the next block. Scales going up and down. He walked through it like a man walking through a familiar room in the dark, knowing where everything was, but unable to stop what was in the dark alongside him. He could not sleep. He lay in the bed that had been his and Margaret's for 22 years, and looked at the ceiling and listened. This was something he had always done in the face of uncertainty, lying still and listening, letting the night tell him what it would. He had made several decisions this way, lying in the dark, following the thoughts wherever they went without trying to direct them. The ceiling was plain white plaster, crossed by a shadow line from the curtained window that moved slightly with some breath of air he couldn't otherwise feel. He watched the shadow line move and thought about the island. He had been born here. Not in this house, but on this island, in a house on the bay side, now long demolished, where his father had lived when he first came from Louisiana as a young man and had decided to stay. He had grown up knowing the island as a child knows the place of its growing, completely, without the awareness of knowing, the knowledge soaked in through years of walking and watching. The shell roads in the old neighborhoods, the way the bay smelled on still mornings, the exact quality of the light in October when the northers began, and the air came clear and bright off the plain to the north. He had this knowledge in his body, not his mind. And now his body was telling him that the place he knew was in danger. Not mild danger, the kind of danger that came from ordinary September storms, the kind that knocked down trees and flooded the streets and then passed. The kind of danger that you did not come back from. He thought about this in the practical way he thought about most things. The island was flat. It was surrounded. The water could come from both sides. If the surge from the Gulf side met the surge from the bay side, there was nowhere for the water to go except over the land, and the land would not stop it. 8 feet above sea level. A surge of 15 feet would cover the entire island. He knew this. He had known it for years in the abstract way. Tonight, it was not abstract. He got up at 3 in the morning and sat on the porch for an hour, listening to the surf, which was definitely louder. Then he went back inside and lay down and eventually, just before dawn, slept. On the morning of September 7th, he woke with the conviction that it was coming today or tomorrow. He had no single reason for this beyond the accumulation of everything he had observed, everything he had measured and felt, everything that had been building over the past 6 days. He got up quickly, as he always did, and dressed and went outside, and the morning confirmed what he had known when he woke. The surf was loud, not roaring, not the sound of the storm itself, but a sustained, heavy impact sound, the sound of large swells breaking, the kind of waves that were not generated by local wind, but by energy traveling from far away. He could feel the impacts through the ground under his feet. He walked to the beach. The tide line was higher than it should have been for the time of day, not by inches, but by feet. He found his survey stick where he had driven it into the sand 3 days ago, at the normal high tide mark for this part of the beach. The water was covering it to a depth of 2 feet. He stood and looked at this and felt no particular emotion, only the calm of confirmed certainty. The sky to the south was building. Not the dramatic black wall of a visible storm, still too distant for that, but a thickening at the horizon, a deepening of the yellowish-gray color he had seen growing for days. The cloud ceiling to the north was lower, and the clouds were moving faster. Everything was being organized, drawn in toward something. He went back to his house and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what he could do and what he couldn't. He could tell people. He had been telling people. He could go to the Weather Bureau again. He could go to the newspapers. He had the thought briefly and let it pass. He was a fisherman with a penciled temperature reading on the back of his hand. He was not a man who went to newspapers. He could move his things to higher shelves. He did this methodically after the coffee. He worked through every room without hurrying, lifting what he could lift, putting the things he valued most as high as he could reach. He went to the Weather Bureau a second time on the morning of September 7th. This time, Isaac Klein was not in the office. Douglas, the younger man, was there, and he was more visibly concerned than Elias had seen him before. His manner had a quality of controlled alertness, the look of a man who was watching his instruments and finding the numbers interesting in a way they had not been yesterday. "Is Mr. Klein available?" Elias asked. "He's doing a beach survey," Douglas said. "Went out this morning to observe the wave conditions." He paused. "The swells are significant." "I know," Elias said. "We've had revised reports from the Weather Bureau in Washington. The storm has not turned as expected. It came through the Straits of Florida during the night." He said this with the careful precision of a man reporting facts that he had not yet fully integrated. "It entered the Gulf this morning." Elias stood very still. "It's in the Gulf, as of this morning's report." "Yes." "Where is it headed?" Douglas hesitated. This was the wrong kind of hesitation, not the hesitation of withholding, but of not knowing. "The track is not definitive," he said. "It could go anywhere along the coast." Elias looked at the barometer on the wall. The needle was low, lower than he'd seen it in years. He had no number to put to it. He couldn't read the fine scale from where he stood, but the position of the needle told him. "It's going to hit us," he said. Douglas looked at him with the young man's face, not disbelieving, not dismissing, but carrying the enormous weight of not being allowed to say what his instruments were telling him. "We are monitoring the situation," he said. Elias nodded and went back down the stairs. He stood in the street for a long moment, and the city was loud around him. Its commerce and its life running at full speed on the morning of September 7th. And he felt very clearly the distance between what he knew and what the city knew, and understood that the distance could not be closed. By afternoon of September 7th, the sky had changed. It did not change dramatically. There was no sudden blackening, no visible wall of storm. But the light had lost all quality of normal afternoon. It was a flat, dead, yellowish light that pressed down on everything and turned colors wrong. The red brick of the levee building had a brown cast. The white facades of the mansions on Broadway looked gray. The oleanders in the garden of a house he passed on Avenue J were no longer pink or red, but a dull, bruised color, as if they had absorbed something from the air. The clouds were moving faster now, and they were lower. A gray-green overcast covered the sky completely, without edge or break, and the bottom of it churned slowly, the way the underside of storm clouds churned, not chaotically, but with a patient, regular motion that spoke of enormous organization. He could feel it looking at it, the size of what was coming. The streets of Galveston were still normal. That was what struck him most, the absolute normality of the streets at 3 in the afternoon on September 7th, 1900. People walking, shops open, a delivery boy on a bicycle weaving between the wagons, a group of men standing outside a saloon with their hats off in the heat. The ordinary machinery of the city running at its ordinary pace. He stopped at the corner of Tremont and Broadway and stood for a while, just watching. A streetcar passed, its bell ringing. The passengers were sitting inside in the ordinary attitudes of people going somewhere, looking out the window, reading a folded newspaper, talking to a companion. There was nothing in their faces. There was absolutely nothing in their faces that told him they were in danger. He put his hand against the wall of the building on the corner. The brick was warm from the afternoon. He felt the solidity of it, a 4-story building, well made, its foundations in the sandy soil of the island. He thought about how high the water could come, and whether 4 stories was enough, and how many buildings in this city were 4 stories, and how many were 1. Then he took his hand off the wall and walked on. Samuel Akers had built boats on the north end of the island for 35 years. He was 71 years old and had been born in Louisiana and come to Galveston as a young man with nothing but skills. And the skills had been enough. He knew what the way some men knew language, intimately, in its varieties and its limitations, with a craftsman's respect for what it could and could not bear. He had built sloops and schooners and small ferries and 100 lesser craft, and he had watched the Gulf from his boatyard through every September of his adult life. He was the only person, besides Father Donovan, who listened to Elias without reaching for reassurance. He had that quality, the quality of a man who had seen enough of the world's indifference to stop requiring it to be otherwise. Elias came to his yard on the afternoon of September 7th and found him sitting in the shade of his shop, drinking coffee from a tin cup, watching the water on the north side of the island. The bay was choppy, moving wrong, small, irregular waves fighting each other, the product of wind and swell coming from different directions. "You feel it," Elias said. Samuel didn't look at him. "Been feeling it 3 days, maybe 4. They sat together for a while without speaking. The bay water slapped against the pilings of the boatyard with an uneven sound. Several of Samuel's boats were hauled out, up on blocks. Others were tied to the dock. "You going to move your boats?" Elias asked. "Where would I move them to? Farther inland. Tie them to something solid." Samuel turned his cup in his hands. "They'll be lost. You know that, probably. Everything in this yard will be lost." He said it without drama, without self-pity, in the same tone he might have used to describe a weather forecast. "I built most of it. I know what it cost. But if what's coming is what I think it is, the yard goes." Elias said nothing. "I'm too old to run," Samuel said, "and I've got nowhere particular to run to." He paused. "What about you?" Elias thought about it. "I'll stay," he said. "Well," Samuel drank the last of his coffee, "at least we'll know we saw it coming." By evening, water was in the streets. Not much, 3 inches, perhaps 4, on the low-lying roads on the Gulf side. It had come in with the evening tide and had not gone out the way the tide was supposed to go out. The tide was not behaving correctly. The water was staying, held back by the incoming swell that was pushing against the normal tidal retreat, and the result was a slow, steady accumulation in the lowest streets, the water brown, and moving sluggishly between the wooden sidewalks. He stood at the corner of Avenue P and 17th Street and watched it. A woman had stopped in the middle of the street to look down at it with mild irritation. Her skirts lifted a few inches above the waterline. An older man crossed the street without paying it particular attention, stepping through it in his boots with the resigned manner of someone who had seen the streets flood before and was not alarmed by it. This was not flooding in the ordinary sense, but the people treating it as ordinary flooding was the thing that worked against him, the thing he could not argue with directly. The evidence of his senses was that this was different, that the water was behaving differently, staying when it should have gone. But the visual appearance was the same as any street flooding, any backed-up drainage after heavy rain, any ordinary tide surge in a low-lying coastal neighborhood. It looked like the thing it was not. He walked further, deeper into the West End, and found the same thing. More water, the streets 3 inches deep, then 4, then in one low section, 6 inches. He stood in the middle of it for a moment. The brown water moved around his boot soles. The evening air above it smelled of the Gulf salt and weed and something deeper, something from below the surface. He turned around and walked back toward his house. He did not know what else to do. He had told the people he knew. He had gone to the bureau. He had talked to Samuel and the priest. He had watched and measured and confirmed what he had suspected. And it had made no difference to anything, because the information that mattered was in his body and his years, and none of that was transferable to anyone who had not earned it the same way. He sat on his porch in the dark for a long time that night and thought about leaving. He could go north to the mainland. He knew people in Houston, Margaret's sister and her husband, people he had not seen in 4 years. He could take the train, there were still trains running, and be off the island by midnight, be in Houston by morning, sitting in a city that was 50 feet above sea level and 80 miles from the water. He thought about this with the deliberate attention he gave to any practical decision, going through the steps of it, thinking about the train station and the cost of the ticket and the walk from his house to the station and what he would bring and what he would leave. He thought about it completely, all the way through to arrival, Margaret's sister at the door in the morning, her surprised face, the explanation he would have to give. And then he sat with the result of this thinking and found that it contained nothing he could act on. He was not afraid of dying. Or rather, he was afraid of dying in the way any man is afraid of the ending of himself. But the fear was familiar, a chronic presence rather than an acute one, and it was not enough to drive him from the island. He had been here his whole life. He was made of this place, its sand, its salt air, its particular slant of light. The idea of leaving it to save himself while 40,000 other people stayed. People who did not have the same certainty that he had, people whose lack of knowledge was not their fault. The idea of this did not sit with him. He could not explain this to anyone. He had tried to explain it to Margaret once, years ago, in a different context, and she had understood it without requiring him to finish. She had said, "You're a man who needs to be present at the things he can't stop." He had not been sure that was entirely right, but it was close enough. He sat on the porch, and the wind carried moisture against his skin, not rain, but spray. The surf sending its fine mist north over the rooftops. He licked his lips and tasted salt. He was staying. He had known this before he started thinking about leaving. The thinking had been a kind of courtesy to the decision. Before midnight, he went to his boat. He walked the 3 blocks to the dock in the dark, and the streets were wet, and the air was full of fine spray that the wind was carrying off the surf. The wind had increased. He estimated 15 miles an hour, gusting to 20 from the northeast. Not the wind of the storm itself. The storm would come from the southeast, from the Gulf side, but the counter-rotation ahead of it, the wind being pulled into the system. He climbed down to the dock planking and felt the dock moving. The whole structure was vibrating with the swell, the pilings working in their base stones, the planks flexing. He walked carefully to where his sloop was tied and looked at her in the dark. The water was higher than it should have been, putting the gunwale nearly level with the dock, where normally there was a drop of 2 feet. He added lines, doubled the bow lines, and ran a new line from the stern to a piling 2 berths down, creating a web of rope that gave the boat angles of pull in 4 different directions. He found a heavy iron ring set in the base of the dock, a mooring ring for larger vessels, and ran a line from the bow cleat to that ring using the last of the good rope in his locker. He checked every knot, pulling against them hard. He knew none of it would hold if the storm was what he believed it was. He knew the boat would be taken. He was not doing this to save the boat. He was doing it because he had always tied his boat, and because to leave it untied, to acknowledge that it was already lost, felt like a surrender to something he was not ready to surrender to. Not hope exactly. He had moved past hope into something more honest. But practice. The practice of a fisherman who tied his boat and checked his knots. When he was done, he sat in the stern for a while and felt the water move under him. The swell was long and heavy. The darkness around him was complete, no moon, heavy cloud cover. And the sound of the surf came from everywhere at once, filling the black air without apparent source. He sat there and listened to it and breathed the salt air and did not think about anything in particular. Then he climbed back up to the dock and walked home. He was awake before dawn on September 8th. He had slept, eventually, a sleep without dreams, the kind of sleep that came from exhaustion and resignation rather than peace. He got up in the dark and went to the window and looked out at the street, and the street was water, not 3 inches, not 6. The street was a channel of dark water moving steadily. He could see the movement even in the darkness, with objects drifting in it. A section of fence, a wooden barrel, something large and pale that he couldn't identify. The water was level with his front porch steps. He stood at the window for a moment, measuring this against what it had been yesterday, what it had been the day before. He went to the kitchen and built a fire and made coffee without hurrying. He ate a cold biscuit that was left from the day before. He moved through these actions with the automatic calm of a man who has made his peace with a thing and now simply exists alongside it. The wind was different. He could hear it in the house itself, a new register, lower and more sustained than anything overnight. And mixed with it, a sound he had no ready word for, a sound like the deep resonance of something very large in motion, a sub-bass vibration that he felt as much as heard in his chest and the bones of his feet on the floor. The storm was not offshore anymore. It was close. He dressed in his heaviest clothes. He put on his oilskin coat, the good one, the one he wore in serious weather on the boat, and his tall rubber boots. He filled a bottle with water from the pump and put it on the kitchen shelf. He took the photograph of Margaret from the bureau and put it inside his coat, against his chest. He told himself he was not being sentimental. He told himself it was simply the one object in the house he would not want to lose. He went to the front door and opened it and looked out. The water was on the porch. Brown, fast-moving water carrying debris, coming up from the Gulf side and pushing through the streets with the force of something that had decided. The wind hit him in the face, a hard, wet, continuous blow, not a gust, but a sustained pressure, the kind of wind that leaned on you. He could see almost nothing in the dark, except the motion of the water in the faint gray of the approaching dawn. He stood there and looked at it. He went back inside and sat in his chair. It was the chair by the window, his chair, the one he had sat in every morning and every evening since he had lived in this house alone. He had sat in it drinking coffee and reading, in good light and bad, in all the Septembers and all the winters and all the long bright springs and the slow hot summers of 25 years. The chair knew him. The shape of it was partly his shape, the worn armrest where he rested his hand, the slight compression of the seat that corresponded to his weight. He sat down into it, and it received him. The wind was increasing. He could hear the house working around him, the creak of the walls, the sound of the roof boards moving, the rattling of the window glass in its frames. These were the sounds a house made under stress, and the stress was increasing. He could measure the increase by ear, the way he had measured everything. The water was at the porch threshold now, and as he sat there, he heard it reach the step and begin to come under the door. A thin, dark line of water crossing the floor toward him, moving with the quiet inevitability of something that had always been coming. He watched it without moving. He looked at the slow spread of dark water across his floor, crossing the boards he had walked every day, approaching the legs of his chair. Outside, the wind was rising past anything it had been, past the range of his experience. He could hear it now in the walls and in the air at once, a sound that had no comparison in ordinary weather, a sound that was not wind anymore, but something the wind became when it reached a certain magnitude, something continuous, absolute, without interior. He had fished in storms for 40 years, and he had never heard this. He thought about the island below the water. He thought about Samuel at his boatyard, and Father Donovan in his rectory, and Thomas Barker 2 houses down. He thought about the people in the low streets on the West End. He thought about the 40,000 in the city of Galveston, in their houses and hotels and boarding rooms, and what the morning would require of them. He thought about all of it calmly and without conclusion. The water reached the legs of his chair. He put his hand inside his coat and felt the edge of the photograph against his fingers. He kept his hand there. Outside, the Gulf of Mexico arrived. Thank you for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye, my friends.